northwards. And then tomorrow, well, a few showers, but for many, it's going to be a fine day. Far from fine out there this evening, though. Low pressure has been moving in, bringing some wet weather across the southwest, and these weather fronts continue to track north overnight. Nothing too heavy for most, but a damp, dank kind of night as it turns quite misty and murky. A few fog patches around. Touch of frost possible through parts of Wales and southwest England. Most towns and cities holding a couple of degrees above freezing, but nevertheless a chilly start, certainly across the Midlands. And it will be quite murky here. Some fog patches for central and eastern parts of England. Rain and drizzle over eastern England and lingering in northeast Scotland. Bit of a wet start for parts of Northern Ireland too. That rain will spread into western Scotland, but for a good chunk of the country it'll be a dry and a bright day once we've lost the morning mist and fog. But some heavy showers across the southeast. Temperatures here could reach 12 Celsius for most, 10 or 11 degrees. The wind's fairly light though, so probably feeling a touch warmer than today. A touch of frost returns though on Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, and Wednesday looking fairly grey again in eastern areas with a few light showers possible, and many western areas dry and bright with some decent spells of sunshine. Temperatures again where it's grey 8 or 9, with a bit of sunshine 11 or 12.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel. 2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together. For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. As George Galloway is sworn into Parliament, the chickens have come home to roost for the Labour Party as a political divide within its voter base caused by mass migration opens up, posing serious problems for the next election. The House of Lords has defeated the Rwanda bill as a majority of peers voted in favour of an amendment enforcing international law onto the bill, probably prompting ping-pong between the upper and lower chamber. Is this constitutionally right? While the government has presented itself as hardline on mass migration, promising to implement record cuts in net numbers, they are hunting for foreign teachers to plug the so-called labour shortage in the education sector, prompting migration from sub-Saharan Africa. Plus, the shadow culture secretary has suggested that the BBC shouldn't be forced to play Rule Britannia at the proms and that the song itself alienates many people. But as Charles Moore argues, Rule Britannia is about freedom and not slavery. State of the Nation starts now. And I'll also be joined by my most Moggalicious panel this evening, former Brexit MEP and current sister, Annunciata Rees-Mogg, and the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole Turner. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's your favourite part of the day. It's the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, our top story from the GB newsroom tonight is that the government has suffered a fifth defeat to its flagship immigration policy, the Rwanda bill, in the House of Lords this evening. Peers voting by 277 to 167 in favour of a monitoring mechanism which would ensure safeguards in the bill will be fully implemented. And that comes after two earlier defeats today where the Lords backed motions making sure the bill is fully compliant with the law. Nearly 50 amendments have been put forward so far, with more being voted on this evening and on Wednesday. Meanwhile, a record 385 migrants crossed the English Channel today, the largest number on a single day this year. GB News understands a seventh small boat crossed into UK waters this evening. It was carrying 49 migrants, and it follows 6 other boats today, which were carrying a total of 336 people who were intercepted by Border Force. Yesterday, the Home Office recorded 327 people arriving in the UK after making the journey in 8 small boats, suggesting an average of around 41 migrants per boat. The Chancellor said today he wants to move the UK to a lower tax economy, but will only do so in a responsible way. Jeremy Hunt was visiting a new digital engineering plant in Wiltshire, where he also announced a £360 million funding boost for manufacturing. Income tax has reached a historic high, and while he's promised some cuts, the Chancellor has been trying to manage expectations ahead of Wednesday's budget.
Want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
Newly elected Rochdale MP George Galloway was sworn into Parliament today. The Workers' Party of Britain leader pledged allegiance to the King as part of the ceremony after winning last week's Rochdale by-election, by more than 5,500 votes. Speaking today, he said, "It's my job to try to make Rochdale great again." And the RNLI is celebrating saving more than 146,000 lives as it marks its 200th anniversary. The Duke of Kent was among those attending a service of Thanksgiving at Westminster Abbey today, during which the Archbishop of Canterbury praised volunteers as models for everyone who risked their lives for people they didn't even know. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution was founded in a London pub 200 years ago as a service to save ships and crew from dangerous coastlines. For the very latest stories, do sign up for GB News Alerts. Scan the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Why does George Galloway matter? He's a maverick, a one-off. He shamefully defended Saddam Hussein, but he magisterially took to pieces a pompous US Senate committee. He shares the recent record with Winston Churchill for being elected for 4 different constituencies. He is a political force of nature, charismatic but dangerous, the abilities of a demagogue but the charm of a seasoned politician. He matters because of the effect he has on the Labour Party and because of what he tells us about modern Britain. In terms of the Labour Party, he emphasises the divide that Keir Starmer has to try to straddle. Starmer wants to eradicate the anti-Semitism that flourished under his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. He has expelled members and even suspended his support for the Labour candidate in the Rochdale by-election. However, the success of Galloway shows that there can be an electoral advantage in appealing to the Islamist vote. This is beyond appealing to the Muslim vote, but to those who have sympathy with the perpetrators of the violence on the 7th of October. The words of Chris Williamson about Auschwitz show how deep and unpleasant this is, and the willingness of Galloway's acolytes to appeal to this basest form of nature.
Strong body of opinion that suggests that the Labour Party deliberately threw their man under the bus because they knew that they were on course to lose this election and lose it quite badly to George Galloway. And by throwing
Chris Williamson, are you seriously suggesting
Ali under the bus,
that the Labour Party wanted its candidate to spout anti-Semitic words, that this was somehow an internal plot? I mean, that's just a territory of conspiracy theory and lunacy, surely.
Well, no, it's not. And secondly, it wasn't anti-Semitic what he said. I mean, the theory, which is not one I subscribe to, nor does George Galloway, but it's a theory that was carried in the New York Times, no less. It's been carried by Israeli media as well. No wonder he's quite happy to sit on his hands whilst Israel is implementing a genocide in Gaza, massacring people on a daily basis. You know, they're actually killing more children every day than actually were being killed in Auschwitz.
This revolting view, disgusting, wicked view, turned out to be electorally successful, and it will create pressure on other MPs to follow suit. Those in seats that have a significant Muslim electorate may feel that Starmer's support for Israel and strong opposition to anti-Semitism is electorally risky. The Labour Party has tried for many years to put together a coalition of minorities, but this ultimately becomes problematic because it divides rather than unites the country. It encourages those who have come here to emphasise separateness rather than unity. So Thangam Debonair's recent comments on Rule Britannia, which are trivial in and of themselves, and we'll talk about in passing later, are indicative of a Labour approach that is unsympathetic to the idea of being British. Now, these aren't British values as such, which are difficult to define, but it's a reluctance to be proud of this country, its history, its achievements over many centuries, and to unite with it and with its people through a sense of patriotism that has brought us all together in the past. George Galloway's victory pushes in the other direction. It weaponises separateness. And that's why it's important, because it divides the Labour Party, and that's a problem because all good democracies need a powerful and effective opposition party. But if the Labour Party were to win an election on this weaponised separateness, it would, of course, divide the nation and creates real risk through that. So if you have a situation that George Galloway is creating of a separate, divided Labour Party that is using this to push electoral success, then you divide the nation and you undermine our democratic principles. As ever, let me know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm delighted now to be joined by Rakib Ehsan, the research analyst and author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. Thank you for coming in. How concerned do you think we should be about this victory for George Galloway?
Well, I think it certainly concerns the political establishment. I think it sent shockwaves throughout the British political establishment. And along with George Galloway winning the by-election, it's worth noting that David Tully, an independent candidate, he finished second, and Galloway won more votes than the total combined for the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats and Reform. In terms of concern, I think that Labour will be particularly concerned. I think that there's been somewhat of a post-Corbyn overcorrection, if you could call it that, where I do think under Starmer's leadership, perhaps the party's become overly pro-Israel. adopting a largely uncritical view of the actions of the Israeli government. It's cozying up to big business. I think it's worth noting that George Galloway, in some of his electoral communication, he emphasised the value of local businesses, being the lifeblood of local communities. So I think that the idea that this was a Gaza-only campaign, I don't think that's strictly accurate.
But that was the first thing that George Galloway said. He said this was for Gaza. So
No,
clearly George Galloway feels that that was the main reason behind it.
That was a strong component of the campaigning. But I think the point that I'd make that his electoral popularity is not confined within, how do you say, Palestine-focused Muslim communities. In fact, that I think he could be quite competitive and he could be a concern for Labour in more pro-Brexit, protectionist, white British working-class communities.
But he hasn't got to that stage yet. This was very much based on a sectarian vote, his success in Rochdale, rather than a broader appeal. It doesn't seem that he had that broader appeal in Rochdale as far as
I think that in terms of that broader appeal, I think I'd make the point that Rochdale as a constituency has that 30% of the constituency in Rochdale are Muslim. We're not talking about a constituency like Birmingham, Hall Green or Hodge Hill, where the majority of constituents are Muslim. So 7 in 10 constituents in the constituency are non-Muslim. I think it's worth making that point.
Yes, but the turnout was...
It was low.
That's right.
And it'll be a lot higher in a general election,
of course. Higher in general election. But in those seats where there is an even higher Muslim population, do you think that Labour candidates will be very tempted to follow the Galloway approach and try and weaponise the separateness?
Well, I'd make the point that this idea of micro-targeting being a new invention in British politics is simply not true. Now, I've lived my entire life in Luton, and I can tell you now that Labour's political messaging in an area such as Bury Park, which has a large Muslim population, is very different to his electoral communication in Stopsley, which doesn't have such a high Muslim population. So this idea of micro-targeting, I wouldn't say that Galloway is unique in adopting such electoral methods.
No, I think the Labour Party has tried to create a majority of minorities over many years, and actually Ken Livingstone tried that in London in the 1980s. That was part of what drove him, was to create this coalition of minorities. But that seems to me to be ultimately very divisive, and it's very important to have a single concept of Britishness that is valid across the country. And it's why I've defended, of all people, Shamima Begum's right to have a British passport, because I think that you're either British or you're not, and that you don't want to divide Britons up into little boxes.
Indeed, and it risks creating a two-tier citizenship in that case. I think that in terms of the Labour Party, what they've tried to appeal to a variety of tribal interests. But I think the point that I've made is that you cannot be the political arm of Stonewall and also the party of British Muslim traditionalists.
Well, that's quite difficult for them, except you saw people in the Palestine marches, LGBT plus people for Palestine, which seemed to me very odd when Hamas is running Palestine. I mean, or running Gaza? How on earth did they manage to do that? But that coalition on the far left does seem to be there.
No, indeed, and I think that with Starmer's leadership, I think Labour is somewhat vulnerable to anti-establishment candidates who emphasise the value of local businesses, perhaps scepticism over the Labour Party being too close to big business, adopting a staunchly pro-Palestine view when it comes to events in the Middle East. But what's really interesting is that Starmer's largely retained that trans-radicalism of the Corbyn era, which means that he's also vulnerable to anti-establishment candidates who defend biological reality in the name of traditional family values.
So in that case, he's facing a real difficulty, because candidates will look at the result in Rochdale and think, well, George Galloway has achieved it by doing this, therefore I can't toe the party line. I must go in the way Galloway has gone. I must emphasise my support for the Palestinians and my opposition to what the Israeli government is doing. That makes it much harder for him to root out the appearance of anti-Semitism, regardless of the reality, and much harder for him to unite the party.
No, indeed, but I think that I'd make a distinction between fighting anti-Semitism, but also you can fight anti-Semitism but also be critical of the actions of the Israeli government.
I agree with that, but what Chris Williams said was horrible, wasn't it?
Well,
in comparison with Auschwitz.
Oh, no, listen, I have no respect for Chris Williamson as an individual. I think that what Labour should do, have that firm message of fighting anti-Semitism, and there's no room for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, or indeed conspiracy theories about Israel. In my view, there's plenty to criticise the Israeli government over when it comes to various forms of militaristic occupation and population displacement. I think that you can fight anti-Jewish hatred, but also express solidarity with the Palestinian people. I think that is a possible position.
It's one that people have found very difficult to maintain, haven't they? That they have tended to slip from one to the other, and that people who've opposed the state of Israel have often ended up moving to a position where they don't want the state to exist at all. So it's quite a fine line that people have to tread.
Well, I think for me, I think there's actually a strong conservative case for Palestinian statehood, which is rooted in national sovereignty, the right to self-determination. I think that what I want to see from more people on the left is that sticking to that firm message, that firm solidarity for the Palestinian people without indulging in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And I'd also make the point that there are prominent Jewish voices as well who have also expressed solidarity with the Palestinian people. So I think the key here is sticking to those important arguments which are rooted in evidence and reason.
Thank you very much indeed, Rakib. Coming up next, when will the House of Lords learn that it's there to maintain the Constitution rather than to thwart the democratically elected will of the people? Plus, does Britain rule... No, does rule Britannia alienate people? Surely not.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Mail on Sunday, and the University of Buckingham is calling out wokery at the University of Cambridge. So I guess the culture wars must be almost over then, Josh.
Almost, yeah. Cambridge University discriminating against rich, white, privileged, privately educated men, claims...
The worst
which
kind.
is basically me. Claims Vice-Chancellor of rival institution, which is launching a degree course on the rise of woke culture. Now, I 100% agree with this. I applied to get into Cambridge, and I didn't get in because I was too thick.
Oh, wow, so it wasn't the DEI mafia?
No, unfortunately, it was pre-DEI. So it's like a double insult now.
Were you one of those guys who was like had a B, a B average? You know, you look like you should be an A because you act like an A.
I act like an A.
You act
I've
like
got
an
glasses.
A. Yeah,
they're fake. I don't even have to. They don't even have lenses. In
Lewis, do you think that this is a little bit cynical? Because I looked up this University of Buckingham, and they opened in 1973, and their tagline on the internet is the home of the two-year degree. They're trying to bring down Cambridge University with this.
Well, why not pick the biggest? I mean, that's why we should be attacking the BBC 24/7 on this thing.
I thought we were.
We aren't. We don't mention it enough.
Listen.
What I found shocking about this story is Buckingham is the country's oldest private university, and was founded in 1976. Something is wrong there. What do you think? Was Oxford founded by the government? I don't think it was. Was Cambridge?
No, absolutely not. I looked up Cambridge was 1209.
Yes, exactly.
So you can
it
get...
wasn't a government
But this is
grant.
actually quite scary. They can do a course on the origins of the woke movement. I'm just saying, someone's going to have a degree, and our job is going to be under threat. They're going to know much more than us.
Never.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. We've been asking the question, does George Galloway matter with his extreme views? And David says, the only time I saw the brilliant Christopher Hitchens look defensive and unnerved was in the electrifying Iraq war debate with George Galloway back in 2005. Parliament is a theatre, and I like to hear eloquent speech, whether it's nuts or not, which Cadbury's used to take and cover in chocolate, those nuts, famous nuts. Clive, however repulsive this new MP is, he craves publicity, and he's now getting it in spades. The media could do us all a great favour by ignoring him. Oh, that's such a good question. Do we just give publicity to people who are dangerous and therefore help them. This afternoon, a majority of noble lords voted in favour of an amendment to the Safety of Rwanda Bill, which reads, "This amendment seeks to ensure that the eventual act is fully compliant with the rule of law while maintaining full compliance with international and domestic law." This poses serious problems for the government because the original Safety of Rwanda Bill included a notwithstanding clause that was included to disapply international law, the very international law seen in the case of the ECHR blocking the original Rwanda deportation flights. So now that this amendment has passed, the phenomenon known as ping-pong is expected to commence, whiff-waff, I think, whereby the bill bounces back between the Lords and the Commons. But as there's not time before an election to use the Parliament Act, their lordships could block the bill altogether. Well, I'm joined by my panel, former Brexit Party MEP Annunciata Rees-Mogg and the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole-Turner. Amy, do you believe in democracy?
I certainly do, which would include a functioning judiciary, would it not? To be in keeping with our constitution.
Would it include an unelected House overriding the will of the British people as represented by their elected democratic members of Parliament?
I think this case highlights the importance of our second chamber and also that our elected House is part of a wider constitution, is it not? And 5 Supreme Court judges unanimously told us that this plan was dead in the water.
But that was a completely bizarre decision because it decided that the judgment of the UN High Commissioner on Refugees was better than the judgment of the British government. It's the most extraordinary thing for the British court to decide.
Might seem extraordinary to you.
It does, because it's not the job of judges to replace ministerial judgment with their judgment.
But
it's their job to uphold the law.
And that's exactly what they did. And unfortunately, you cannot legislate things that do not exist into reality. You can't legislate.
No, but that's nonsense. Sorry to be so blunt, but it's not a matter of fact whether Rwanda is safe. It's a matter of opinion and a matter of judgment. It's not, is today Monday, which Parliament cannot say today is Tuesday and be correct. But it can say that in our judgment this is safe. And it seems to me the democratic judgment is better than the judicial judgment in this instance.
I think it is most of the electorate's opinion at this stage that the Rwanda bill is garbage.
That,
and
I think, is very unlikely, Annunciata.
All right, if we want to talk about judgments, the UN itself has decided that Rwanda is a safe place and is sending people there. So you can't think that the judiciary are more knowledgeable, more insightful than our elected democratic House or indeed the largest national body, which I think often does get things wrong, but on this occasion is correct. Some things always happen.
But were the example you used, which you've used before on the programme, so I looked into it because it's an interesting example. So Afghan girls were taken to Rwanda to be schooled, right? But that was a voluntary programme. This is entirely different.
No, but it's saying Rwanda is safe for some refugees to go.
In certain circumstances.
And then they don't want us to use it.
If we look at a scheme that was similar, and I know I've brought this up loads of times before, was the Israel scheme. And migrants died. Migrants went missing. It was unsafe. And Rwanda was proven to be unsafe in those circumstances.
And when the complaint first got raised that they might send people back to the countries from which they had come illegally in the first place, and that might make them unsafe, the Rwandans agreed to change the terms of the deal so that they promised not to. That element has gone as a threat.
But, Amy, I think you touch on something that is fundamental, because it's what all the Lord supporters of this amendment have said. They've said that Parliament cannot vote to make black white. But this isn't making black white. It's a question of judgment. And in a democracy, should the judgment be taken by people who are accountable and can be removed, or should it be taken by people who are unaccountable and are there for a determined period of time without removal by votes?
I think that this Supreme Court is showing its worth and why we need it and why we require it. And I do think it's the job of unelected officials in this capacity to do this. One thing I want to bring up...
But do you accept that it's a matter of judgment? Deciding whether something is safe is a matter of judgment rather than of hard facts.
Isn't every court decision in that sense, an opinion. But ultimately, it's not everything.
No, not everyone is. Sometimes it is a straightforward fact. Did X murder Y?
But
that is a matter of
But
fact.
there are straightforward facts that we can see from the Supreme Court ruling.
And then you draw on those facts to make a judgment. And it seems to me that must be the right of those who are accountable. It's why the judges and the Lords are exceeding their authority.
Well, what's the point of having a judiciary then if we don't put it to use when we require it?
You have the judiciary to judge whether the powers exist for the government to do what it has proposed. The government clearly had the powers to do it because they'd been passed by Parliament, and it was purely the judgment that was being questioned. That doesn't seem to me to be the proper sphere of the courts.
I think it's undeniable now that the ruling of the court needs to be upheld and that international law is
Our laws are written by our Parliament. That is part of our democratic process. The way in which they write them is then interpreted as the letter of the law by judges. However, no Parliament can tie the hands of its successor, and therefore, if this government decides it is lawful, it is lawful. And that is true under international law as well, because it cannot tie future Parliament's hands in terms of international treaties, and we could just leave.
And Annunciata is absolutely right on that international law has no standing in UK law until it is adopted by Parliament. We have a dualist system. International law places potential obligations on ministers, but it doesn't place any legal obligations on the country unless passed by Parliament.
However, surely if you roll it back one more stage and you look at the democratic will of the people, was this ever really voted in? We voted to tighten our borders, we voted for secure borders, but we did not vote for this bill that we're seeing now.
I don't think we should be governed by opinion polls, but if you want to question the will of the people, opinion polls are overwhelmingly in favour of dealing with the migration problem.
Dealing with the migration problem, not of the Rwanda bill. One thing is...
Well, I've let Amy, who isn't my sister, have the last word. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, I'll be discussing why you may be about to see an increase in teachers from Africa in Britain's schools. Plus, should trans women be allowed into Hampstead's women-only bathing ponds?
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Yeah, so describe the contents of the letter for us, because it is quite strongly worded, isn't it? And it suggests that your property is empty. And what do they suggest it's going to be used for?
They say, as part of this process, Northamptonshire Council is identifying empty properties and sites within the area, with the aim of encouraging owners to bring premises back into use or to find alternative options for derelict sites. The resettlement team in Northamptonshire Council supports asylum seekers and refugees across 3 different projects: Homes for Ukraine, Afghan resettlement and asylum dispersal. At present, we are seeing a considerable increase in positive immigration decisions being made in favour of asylum seekers. So basically, they're wanting accommodation. But who goes around and assesses whether these properties are lived in or they are actually empty?
Clearly, Ted, no one had bothered to come and look at your house at all, had they?
What do you want now? Because clearly you are both very shaken by this letter, and that letter that you received in response has not gone far enough. Do you want an apology? What more do you want to see?
Well, she said here that she's, I sincerely apologise, this Lindsay Bellchambers, but I don't see, there was no explanation as to how they've come to say this property was empty, whether it was disused, whether it was unkempt, or what. If you go back through the history of the property, it's not been empty.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Well, thank you for rejoining us. We've been talking about Rwanda and their lordships, and Margaret says the Rwanda bill has cost us millions so far, and not one immigrant has been sent there, though several Home Secretaries have been. And Simon says, Sir Jacob, I'm a fairly simple sort of chap, simple Simon, I suppose, and it seems to me that there is a simple solution to the Lords' problem, a short bill repealing Blair's disastrous House of Lords Reform Act, 1999. And Richard says on Galloway, Jacob, you said we need a powerful and effective opposition. It might surprise you to know that many in the UK think that since February 2020 there has been no political opposition. It seems the vast majority of MPs are singing off the same hymn sheet. Oh dear. Almost every week, it seems as if there is another revelation shining the light on the extent to which mass migration is being used to fill the so-called labour gap. And while the government has declared its intention to implement the largest ever reduction in net migration, it has been revealed that overseas applications for teacher training have doubled this year after a government recruitment drive offered £10,000 payments to foreign teachers to come to Britain. At the heart of net migration is the issue of economics. Many have pointed out that mass migration is not economically beneficial. But today, a Conservative MP, Neil O'Brien, has revealed that HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, is hiding the figures which would allow people to calculate the fiscal effect of migration. It already does not publish welfare claims broken down by original nationality, but has now stopped publishing data on tax contributions by nationality too. This is a strange decision to have made, as at the heart of the migration debate is the economic consequence. Well, with me now is the UK's leading demographer, Paul Morland, as well as my panel, Nunziata Rees-Mogg and Amy Nicole Turner. Paul, thank you very much. We've got this migration issue, 1.4 million net in the 2 years to the middle of 2023, 1.4 million visas then issued in 2023, and yet we've got 5.5 million people economically inactive. So to what extent is it demographic, and to what extent is it that we're not using the resources that we've got properly?
Well, back in the 60s, a lot of women didn't work, and back in the 80s, there were a lot of unemployed. Today, there are these people not working who we would like to work and for various reasons aren't. And I'm not for a moment saying it's inevitable or nothing can be done about it. But actually, if you look at the share of people of working age who are actually in the labour market, and then that data goes back to the 19th century, by historic standards, it's very high. So there's no doubt we could do more to get more people into the labour force. But at the same time, we have to recognise that can only go so far. The fundamental problem of the British labour market is not whether we can squeeze an extra 100 or 200,000 out of that group of people, but the fact that we've had 50 years of not having enough children. And there simply aren't enough people coming into the workforce compared to those leaving it. It was 2 to 1 when I started in the workplace in the 80s. Now it's barely 1 to 1.
And this is then an issue for pensions, where the number of people in work supporting pensioners is declining, making the pensions a bigger burden for the working population. But if you didn't have mass migration, wouldn't this be a big incentive to increase productivity, which the UK economy has miserably failed in for the last 30 years?
There's no doubt our productivity has been really disappointing, even by international standards. But it's quite striking how across the developed world, productivity has been really flat. And that's something that economists wrestle with. But just as I don't think squeezing that 500,000 stock of people and getting another 100 or 200,000 out to work is going to be the solution, nor do I believe that there's a magic productivity solution. There's no doubt that by mass immigration, we do, on the margin, discourage investment in labour-saving investment. There's no doubt about that. But that can only go so far. I think a more practical approach is to look at immigration and say, where do we really need immigrants to fill labour gaps? And where do we not? Do we need such huge numbers of people coming into the country, for example, to attend not very good universities or even not attend not very good universities and then never leave. So really, I think you need to look at immigration as part of the solution to the labour problem, which itself is a result of not having enough children, but to laser focus it on that issue alone.
And what are other countries doing to solve this problem? Because we know that South Korea and Japan are more advanced down this route of not replacing their population. How are they solving the problem?
Well, they're not really. I mean, Japan has got very low labour productivity anyway, and certainly could do more in that respect. It is actually having some immigration, although very limited immigration. But the Japanese economy has been flatlining since the late 80s. Government debt to GDP in Japan, which is the other aspect of the problem that you're talking about, where we not only have the pensions issue, but an 80-something has a much higher burden, is a much higher burden on the health service than a 20-something. In Japan, the government debt to GDP ratio is 250%. When we were approaching 100%, the market seemed to panic. Now, why Japan can get as far away with 250 is another question, but they are going to hit a bump in the road.
It's an interesting question, and Japan's domestic savings and so on all tie into that. But what about Neil O'Brien's revelation that HMRC is withdrawing some of the historic information that it used to dish out? It's a very odd thing to do, isn't it? Because it makes it much harder to see what the economic benefit is of migration and therefore to make suitable policy around it.
Well, I don't know why they've done that, and I think he should ask a follow-up question as to why. But I think it's absolutely shocking that as this debate gets going, as we have more and more immigrants, and therefore it's totally legitimate to be debating this, that they're closing down the information. I don't want to suppose that it's due to bad faith, but I think he should be probing why that is, because if the fundamental argument for immigration is economic, we really need the economic data in order to make the case or not. And if they're covering it up, it makes you think something dodgy is going on, whether it is or not.
Always right, isn't it, Amy, that if something's being covered up, you think something dodgy is going on?
But what was the word you used there? It was mainly driven by economics, because I don't think it is necessarily. I think it's just driven by they've run out of options, and it's a very practical solution because we basically do not maintain our workforce. It's like a car, we don't look after it. So I was shocked today to read about the number of 16 to 24-year-olds who are economically inactive. And it wasn't due to laziness, it was due to poor health, poor mental health, poor physical health, not feeling like you could be part of the workforce. So I think our society, we need to step up and look after that and attend to that and look after it as if it was a car.
But I think, Nancy, I don't know if you agree, that using migration in teaching is an easy option and that it's to do with pay and it's to do with trying to fill gaps quickly, whereas there's an apprentice scheme for people to go into teaching who haven't got degrees, and they suddenly say they haven't got the money for that, for local people. This is a really odd way of approaching things.
And there have been plans to scrap repayments on loans for people who go into the areas of teaching that have the biggest shortages, mainly the STEM science subjects. The average physics teacher starts on 35 grand a year. You have done 4 years of a physics degree, you have done your QTS qualified training, teacher training, and people aren't prepared to do it. What we've got to do is look at that fundamental problem. Yes, fine, use teachers from another country in the short term to plug a gap, but we shouldn't be training them from scratch. We should be training our own people to do these jobs and making them attractive enough that they will relocate from other areas.
Isn't Paul's point broadly right? You've got to work out where the gaps are that you need to fill, and you have to pay people more in other areas. I mean, I've slightly extrapolated your point.
The gaps are absolutely everywhere. And when you look at the labour shortages list of unskilled workers on the government website, it's basically every profession.
And I think that's why it's ultimately...
It's even things like graphic designers.
It's ultimately
we have a shortage of.
Demographic issue, because today we're talking
we literally haven't got enough people.
We're talking about teachers. 2 years ago, we were talking about lorry drivers or tanker drivers. Next week, we'll be talking about doctors and nurses. You can throw money at any one sector, but it's like whack-a-mole. When you've sold that particular sector, if you've got a lack of workers relative to the population because of demographic issues, a problem will pop up elsewhere.
Is the problem not really that our entire welfare state, particularly for pensioners, is set up essentially as a Ponzi scheme where you constantly need younger people feeding in to pay for the outcomes at the end of one's life? And that is not sustainable. No Ponzi scheme has ever been sustainable, and that needs a structural change in itself.
It would be feasible if we were having 2 to 3 children. We don't have to follow the exemplary case of some of our leading politicians, but 2 to 3 rather than 1 to 2. And the fact we've had below replacement since the 70s, it takes a while to feed through, but when it does, you have labour shortages in all sorts of areas, and 2 to 3 will keep the sort of pyramid that would allow the economy to function normally. We don't need to have
All right, so we've all got to have lots of children. GB News viewers, pay attention. More children, the merrier. 6 is a good starting point. Now, the government spokesman has said in relation to Neil O'Brien, listen to this, we are reviewing possible data sources to enable us to report more accurately on benefit claimants' nationality in the future. Well, when I was in government, I wanted to get rid of a lot of these government spokesmen and PR people because they do nothing useful and they put out useless statements like that tell you nothing. Anyway, thank you to Paul and to my panel. Coming up, is Rule Britannia about slavery or about freedom? Plus, socialist Hampstead has found itself in a bathing pond-related trans row just up Amy Street.
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, massive day. Galloway is sworn in and he immediately says the quiet bit out loud.
The next election will be about Muslims.
But who's he coming for?
That will vitally affect the election of the Labour deputy leader.
Is Galloway conning the Muslim vote? Plus, are dodgy, unqualified immigrants working in your loved one's care home? We expose the cash for care scandal. And the Church of England looks set to pay £1 billion to say sorry for slavery. Is it now just a woke lobby group? Don't miss Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m.
Nana Queer, weekends from 3 p.m.
So after his mad dash to see his father last week, Prince Harry predictably went on TV to talk about it. He gave his first interview to Good Morning America, whilst apparently being filmed by a crew that were doing a documentary on the Invictus Games. He didn't disclose his father's diagnosis, but frankly, even the fact that he was on TV talking about it was concerning. No wonder they're keeping him at arm's length. This is what he said.
How did you get the news that the King was ill?
I spoke to him.
And what did you do next?
I jumped on a plane and went to go and see him as soon as I could.
How was that visit for you emotionally?
Look, I love my family. The fact that I was able to get on a plane and go and see him and spend any time with him, I'm grateful for that.
An illness in the family can have a galvanizing or sort of reunifying effect for a family.
Absolutely.
Is that possible in this case?
Yeah, I'm sure. Throughout all these families, I see it on a day-to-day basis. The strength of the family unit coming together.
He also said that he loves his family, but then he said that he had his own family in America. So which family does he love? The late Queen's last few years of life were marred with accusations of racism, which Harry later backtracked on, claiming that they hadn't actually used the word, so inadvertently admitting to gaslighting us all. But the Sussex's stock is falling in the States, and the only thing that makes them interesting is their proximity to the royal family. And now the King is ill, Harry has even offered to muck in and take on official duties to help his father. Look, I want to see reconciliation and love and joy, but I'm afraid Meghan has yet to even speak to her father as far as we know, and Harry didn't apparently even reach out to his brother. Whilst his dad might fall for it, I doubt William will be as soft. Good luck with that, Harry.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We were talking about immigration, and Anne says we need to return to teacher training colleges and abandon the ridiculous notion of primary infant school teachers needing a degree for nursing too. And that obviously might help local people teach. And Philip says, Philip, your point is brilliant. I absolutely love it. Hi, Sir Jacob. If the birth rate is low in the UK, why do we need to import more teachers? Who are they teaching? That's a brilliant question. And on the Rwanda bill, John says, I've worked in Rwanda since 2010. It's not only one of the safest countries in the world, it's also one of the cleanest, a beautiful country. Well, John, I trust your view over that of the UN High Commission on Refugees, who are such hypocrites. Back in January, the royal wedding cellist Sheku Kana Mason reignited the Rule Britannia debate after suggesting that the song makes some people uncomfortable. These comments, of course, echoed the EU-loving BBC attempts to remove the lyrics of Rule Britannia back in 2020 amidst the Black Lives Matter brouhaha. But over the weekend, Shadow Culture Secretary Thangam Debonair said that it was up to the BBC whether it wanted to play the song at the last night of the proms or not, and that it wasn't the government's job to tell cultural institutions how to run events. I don't actually disagree with that, but she then went on to say that the song alienates many people. Well, with me now is the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young, as well as my panel, who you remember is Nunziata and Amy. Toby, thank you very much for coming in. So when Britain first at Heaven's Command arose from the azure main, this was the anthem of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain. Isn't this something we should be proud of and that should unite us as a country because we were the nation that rooted out slavery?
Yes, I mean, it's often a point overlooked when people criticise Rule Britannia. It's a celebration of the Royal Navy and the role it's played in not only preserving our freedom, but we shouldn't forget that the West Africa Squadron, which was established in 1807 and lasted for almost 60 years, was created to abolish slavery, abolish the slave trade in the mid-Atlantic, and did so with some success. It freed over 150,000 slaves. So the idea that this song, celebrating the Royal Navy, is somehow inextricably linked to colonialism and the slave trade is just for the birds.
You can't say that. You can't say it's for the birds. Look at the lyrics. Rule Britannia, rule the waves. Britain will never be slaves. I mean, that obviously is going to make people feel certain things, and that's why people are so upset by it.
It's about us leading the world in freedom, in liberty.
Oh, OK.
And the Mansfield judgment, which you have at around the time it's written, which says there is no concept of slavery in England, and this is so important.
I know there is this academic explanation of the song lyrics, but people perceive them differently, and people hear Britain will never be slaves, and they feel hurt by it.
But why?
Why shouldn't we be slaves?
You're making a leap. No, the connotation isn't clear. You're leaping from saying Britons should never be slaves to somehow thinking that implies other people, lesser people, should be slaves.
Britannia
it doesn't imply that. And we know it doesn't imply that because we did free other people who were enslaved.
OK, but we had 200 years of the worst human atrocity in history.
And it's exactly why we should sing the song, so that people can understand quite how important our history is and be able to take pride in the changes we made to the global environment that did stop slavery.
Because no other country did this. No other country tried to get rid of slaves.
But that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is people hear it and they hear certain connotations and it makes them uncomfortable, which is why this debate keeps coming round and round and round again.
But if they've heard something that is wrong, then surely the effort should be to correct what people have heard and say this is about the abolition of slavery and about the freedom that anybody in England enjoys.
That's why I'm up for tweaking it, Jacob. I'm not going to say cancel it. I'm going to say tweak it.
Well, how would you rewrite it?
Rule Britannia, rule the waves, all people shall never be slaves. Done.
But isn't it fine saying Britons because we are leading the world? We're setting an example.
But if I've told you people are feeling hurt by it, there's swathes of people in the population who have said this song makes me uncomfortable. Why don't you just hear it? Like, for example, in the national anthem, there was a section in the national anthem that said about crushing rebellious Scots, and it was removed.
Well, and papists, actually.
So let's just tweak it.
Our knavish tricks. I'm not sure
papish tricks.
I believe people when they say they are made uncomfortable by it. I think they're just making that that excuse in order to engage in fighting a culture war. I mean, the irony of the interview that Thangam Debonair gave, in which she said that many people are alienated by these lyrics, she accused the Conservative Party of doing more to fight culture wars than fight for British culture. What could be more of a culture war thing to do than to attack the lyrics of Cool Britannia? She might as well be the Shadow Secretary of State for culture wars.
She also hailed the BBC as a great provider of joy and jobs. Well, I don't know if she's watched it recently, but it's deeply depressing, and Jobs for the Boys isn't my style.
Well, there we go, and at the same time, some foolish headmistress has decided that houses shouldn't be named after Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, other great heroes of our nation. But moving away from heroes of Britain and Rule Britannia to the mill ponds of Hampstead Heath, a row has unfolded after gender-critical campaigners lost a vote to ban trans women from entering the female-only ponds. The meeting reportedly heard claims from women that they didn't feel safe, with one campaigner suggesting that it was inevitable cases of sexual assault would occur. So the question is, should trans women, that is to say men who now identify as women, be allowed in Hampstead's female-only bathing ponds? Well, Amy, I'm going to give you the first word on this and the main say on this.
But you know what I'm going to say.
I do, but it's very important because I mean, you try and explain this to me. You made the case to me both privately and publicly. You bought me a book, which I read. And I really want to understand the other side of this. Why is it reasonable that essentially a man who is pretending to be a woman...
Well, that's unreasonable to start with, isn't it?
But not somebody who's had an operation.
No.
Just decides that morning to be a woman, should be able to use a woman's space. Jacob, I do not understand it. The floor is yours.
No one is waking up one day and deciding to be a woman. It's an immutable part of yourself.
That's not true.
You
let me speak.
Born with. No, it is. But the thing that frustrates me about this story was the fact that they went to a vote with the people who use the swimming ponds, and they said, of course we want to allow trans women. And then it was a minority of women who don't even use the swimming ponds who came in to cause disruption. There are no cases of problems at this swimming ponds, apart from one cis man in the mixed ponds who was caught...
What is a cis man, just out of interest?
You are a cis man.
Oh, I'm a man.
Assigned male at birth. But that was where the problem was. So trans women who want to use the women-only ponds want to do so for the same reason that I, as a cis woman, want to use it, to stay away from cis men who might cause a problem. So, of course, they should be allowed to use the female-only ponds because they carry with them the same risks that all us biological women do as well.
But do they really, when they look in all senses, when in a state of undress for bathing, like a woman?
I feel like you haven't met any trans women, because the way you imagine, I think you imagine, like Toby putting on a blonde wig and suddenly being called Tabina, and that's kind of how it goes.
But
which
Amy, my
is
question
a crass caricature of what a trans person is.
You wouldn't ban him if he did.
It may be, Amy, that the trans women who want to bathe in the women's area
and
in Hampstead Ponds,
happily.
It may be that they are all, as you say, completely sincere. They're not wanting to take advantage of that opportunity to spy on naked women or anything like that. But what if some of them are? How are you going to differentiate? How are you going to find out? Are you just going to take it on faith that they are who they represent themselves as being?
Yeah, because when you go into
what about the safety of the other women?
Hang on a minute. If a predatory man wants to go into a swimming pool, a changing room, a women's toilet, he's going to go in, whether it says female only or not. So his argument doesn't really stand.
Why make it easy for them?
Hang on a minute. How is that making it easy for them? Because how would you actually police this? So when you get to the swimming ponds, by all means, you appear like a woman, you identify. Do you kind of have a genital flash? Because on a trans woman's passport, it would say legally female, F. So how are you going to practically, in a practical sense,
you've been uncharacteristically quiet.
I want to take Amy up on something. Said you don't. No one wakes up one morning and decides they want to be female. I actually have an old late friend who really did do that. And there are people, and I think it's very discriminatory to say that they don't exist. That he felt more feminine some days, he felt more masculine some days. And the one thing he always said was, I am never going to be a woman. I am feeling different as to who I am in me, but it doesn't make me the same as someone who was born that way. And I think that's something we really have to accept, that there are very major differences between the genders, not just in our physicality, but in our mentality, but also by not creating safe spaces that are purely for women who are, I'm afraid to say, genuinely and statistically the weaker sex. We are opening risk unnecessarily to women.
Well, thank you very much to Toby and to my panel, to Nunziata, who remains a sister, and to Amy, who's part of the sisterhood. That's all from me. Up next is Patrick Christys. Patrick, what's on your bill of fare this evening?
Yeah, great show, Jacob. Well, look, there's a heck of a lot on tonight. We're going to be talking about unqualified foreign carers in our care home sector. George Galloway has said the next election is going to be a Muslim election. What does all of that really mean? And Welby, should he apologise over his Rwanda Nazi comments?
Oh, my goodness. Well, as always, that's going to be so exciting. I will be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. And although there was a little precipitation in Somerset over the weekend, I'm assured that it'll be normal service resumed tomorrow with glorious, wonderful, sunny weather.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Evening, welcome along to your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Bit of fog forming overnight, wet weather's pushing its way northwards, and then tomorrow, well, a few showers, but for many it's going to be a fine day. Far from fine out there this evening, though. Low pressure has been moving in, bringing some wet weather across the southwest, and these weather fronts continue to track north overnight. Nothing too heavy for most, but a damp